Bay Area Skeptics proudly presents our monthly Skep Talk. Bay Area Skeptics was founded in 1982 and is the oldest regional skeptical organization in North America. We're skeptical, meaning that we believe in critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, prominent scientists like Carl Sagan and magicians like James Randi became concerned about public science illiteracy and the popular fondness for pseudoscience. They established a movement called scientific skepticism, which encouraged thoughtful, evidence-based discourse in matters of health, education, consumer protection, and particularly in the investigation of extraordinary claims. Scientific skepticism embraces their ideal of using inquiry and evidence to reduce irrational thinking in society. We trust the scientific method, evidence-based thinking, and the innate societal value of civil discourse. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Meetup, and on our website for news and upcoming activities. To be put on our mailing list, send your contact information to info@baskeptics.org. Membership in Bay Area Skeptics helps support these monthly talks and our other activities. Please join us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our Skeptical conference. We invite you to participate in making the world just a little more reasonable by spreading the word about Bay Area Skeptics and our activities. Before we hear tonight's speaker, let me remind you of our Skep Talk for next month, February 11. Dr. Nathan Lentz speaking on From Junk to Genes, the birth of new microRNA genes in the human genome. And now tonight's speaker. Science and society intersect very often on many subjects. Because science is such a powerful cultural institution, people of many ideological persuasions have been tempted to claim that science supports their position. Not infrequently, science is distorted and contorted in the process. I suspect this tradition goes back to the very beginning of science as a profession, but we certainly have many examples from more recent history. A field in which I have some expertise, creation science, is a good example of misusing science to support an ideological position. Eugenics is another. In such cases, it is not uncommon to find the legal system also drawn into this web of ideology and science. Our speaker tonight has degrees both in history and law, which provides him special insight into this matter. Paul Lombardo holds an endowed chair in the Georgia State University School of Law at the Center for Law, Health, and Society, where he teaches courses on genetics and the law, the history of bioethics, mental health law, and the legal regulation of human research. He advised the Presidential Commission for Bioethical Issues from 2011 to 2016, the good years, and has also advised on several documentaries, as well as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. His book on the Kerry Buck case, 3 Generations, No Imbeciles, Eugenics, the Supreme Court, and Buck v. Bell, was described as a legal and historical mess. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul Lombardo, speaking on the continuing relevance of America's eugenic legacy. And now, if we were all in person, here's where you would give him a welcoming round of applause, but I'll just ask Ray to switch me off and him on. Ray? Okay?
Thank you, Jean. Appreciate the kind words. My goal this evening is to cover a broad set of topics and try to give you some insight into what this word eugenics meant to people as much as 100 years ago. I also want to shed some light on how the topic highlights issues of interest to people from diverse fields, not just as a relic of history, but as an area that is relevant to the time we are living in today. So I'll start at the beginning with the word itself. What was this thing, eugenics? Well, as I say here, it was a word, it was a movement, it was a body of law, but I think most importantly, it was a rhetorical strategy focused on excluding marginal populations from the benefits of American life. So let's go first to the word. Every history of eugenics starts with Francis Galton, who coined the term in 1883. And this was his formal definition. The word itself means, from the Greek, well-born. It was described in another place as the conscious re-engineering of human society. The second person we have to mention, particularly when we talk about American examples of eugenics, is of course the Austrian monk Gregory Mendel. If you put eugenics down, that eugenics to me is an equation that equals Galton plus Mendel. So you've got Mendel's laws of heredity and his famous pea plant studies, married to the biological hereditary look at biostatistics, which really comes from Galton and his followers. But it took almost an entire generation for somebody to write a whole book about this, and that was Galton's acolyte Caleb Salaby, somebody we don't talk about very much, but he's the person who gave us the simple taxonomy to identify human policies, eugenic policies, as either positive or negative. It didn't take very long before that idea became quite widespread. It's a little bit too simplistic to try to understand eugenics as just a two-sided program, but it is worthwhile to note that some of the motive force of eugenics was an optimism about what could be improved in society. This was an optimistic side really driven by hope. And that hope extended to the happy face of better baby contests, which like this newspaper article shows us, identified particularly gifted tots whose parents decided they would keep them in touch so that they could get married and have other such superior babies. And when families pursued this ideal, they were celebrated in their communities. There were fitter family contests shown here. Science applied to human stock, the same principle that developed champion cows and horses, prize egg-laying hens, and on, all of which would set the day to regulate rules for human mating. The Fitter Family Contest generated awards, and the most famous and most prized award was this bronze medallion inscribed with a line from the Bible in the book of Psalms, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage." It is really difficult to exaggerate how pervasive the word eugenics was in the early 20th century, and the extraordinary number of meanings it took on having to do with health and hygiene and prosperity. How it was used in advertising gives us one clue about the popularity of the concept. And I could show you dozens and dozens of these, but just start with this. There were eugenic dolls. And of course, eugenics was closely associated with agriculture and animal husbandry and farming. And so we have eugenic corn. There were eugenic cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, from lemon shampoo to hair tonic. And then even eugenic diamonds, which, just like eugenic marriages, required a certificate of fitness. By 1913, to some people, eugenics made the world go round. And so here we have the famous humorous magazine of satire, Puck, where displacing Cupid, Dr. Eugenics holds the world on his feet, and Cupid cries, having been displaced by science. Now that's the hopeful side. That's what we might call the optimistic side of eugenics. But the side we know the most about has much more to do with hate. And it's captured by the kind of propaganda that was produced by people in the eugenics movement. The side that represented people's fears often included a heavy-handed kind of biological determinism that played out in propaganda like this. This triangle of life shows us what you have is your environment, what you do is your education, but what you are is your heritage. What you really are, as it says, was all settled when your parents were born. The trick here is selecting better parents. And if you did, you would find, as this display showed, playing at the Sesquicentennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, and then later under the Capitol Dome in the United States Capitol during the debate over immigration restriction in 1924. More about that soon. This blinking light showed you how much money crime cost, and how every 50 seconds a person is committed to jail, and how normal people don't go to jail. This was a companion placard which tells us that some people are born to be a burden to the rest, high-grade people are rare. Criminals, people with bad heredity, the insane, the feeble-minded, and other defectives, they cost us lots of money. So this is part of the ongoing propaganda of the eugenics movement. And it was, in fact, a movement. It was a social and institutional movement which was run by some of the best known people in American science and society. So here's a shot of the premier organization in eugenics, the Eugenics Record Office, which put out this letterhead showing its scientific board appointed in 1910. And as you can see, it included people like Alexander Graham Bell. Of course, we know him as the founder of, as the inventor of the telephone. He was also very interested in heredity and genetics. William Welch, the father of medical education at Johns Hopkins University. His colleague Lou Ellis Barker, an anatomist. Irving Fisher, first political scientist to get a PhD at Yale. And then Thomas Hunt Morgan, the first geneticist to win the Nobel Prize in 1933. Down at the bottom, you have Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin, the staff members there. Davenport, the director, and Laughlin, the superintendent. And I'll have a bit more to say about each of them as well. The Eugenics Record Office had a number of subsidiary organizations, such as the American Eugenics Society and the Eugenics Research Association. And members of those groups would meet at national and international meetings. There were 3 international meetings, the first in London in 1912. And there were also other organizations like the Battle Creek Race Betterment Foundation, which met in 1914 and I believe also in 1916 in Battle Creek, Michigan. To be a good animal is the first requisite to success, and to be a nation of good animals is the first condition of prosperity. That was a quote that was used by the Race Betterment Foundation. Organizations overseas had similar propaganda. For example, the British Eugenics Organization put out this poster. So this is the dark side of eugenics, the side that represented and really in some cases encouraged a popular anxiety about a demographic abyss which the country was supposed to be heading toward. Now, I want to take a few minutes to describe all the ways that eugenics made its way into American law. I am a historian of law, and so it's worthwhile to remember that the law was the vehicle that insinuated eugenic thought into American life in the most thorough way. And so here we have a list of all the laws that eugenics touched. These are only the categories. There are over 100 specific statutes passed by the states and also the federal government that invoked eugenic policies. The various kinds of marriage restriction laws, there are 3 of them there, which I'll be talking about. The immigration restriction law, which was a federal statute in place for 40 years at the national level. Something almost no one has written about. I just finished a paper on it myself, the Prohibition Amendment, which was very much affected by eugenic thought. And then finally, the one we do know a lot about, which is sterilization laws. So I'm going to go through each one of these categories in turn. First, we have the earliest laws, proposals to prohibit people with disabilities, in this case, people with problems in sight, from getting married. This proposal came from the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, William Hayes, who was in the cabinet of, in the department, which was in Teddy Roosevelt's cabinet. He was appointed to a committee of eugenics of the American Breeders Association when this government control of marriage was proposed. Even more popular than restrictions on marriage for the disabled. Well, here's another one about bonding of blind couples. Another Harvard scientist suggests the same thing some years later in 1928. But a law that was the most successful, that in thousands of headlines is described as the eugenic marriage law, are the laws that required people to have a medical screening before marriage, to be tested for sexually transmitted infections. The first law was passed in Washington in 1909, and in 1910 it went into effect It was a public health law to prevent marriage between people with STDs. And as I said, these were all called the Eugenic marriage laws. This newspaper shows the battle over Wisconsin's, which was one of the most controversial. The state challenged the law. It eventually was upheld at the level of the state Supreme Court. By the 1940s, most states had followed that lead. A third group of laws, about which much has been written, were called laws to preserve racial integrity, or the anti-miscegenation laws. And they were meant to prevent interracial marriages. They were sold as public health enactments as a necessity to prevent the spread of what were thought to be deficiencies in all other races that would pollute the white race if they were in contact with this inferior strains. And this is one of the clearer examples in American law of the racial side of eugenics legislation. And it was in place from 1924 until 1967, when all such laws were struck down. There were 16 still in place in 1967. They were struck down in the famous case of Loving versus Virginia. A law that stayed in place about the same amount of time was the law to restrict immigration. Immigrants, particularly non-white immigrants, were regular targets of eugenic scorn. The recent immigration at that time was leading to what some, most notably Teddy Roosevelt, called race suicide, the replication of the less desirable families and the deterioration of the so-called older American stock. These are immigrants who are disembarking at Ellis Island in the first decade of the 20th century, and they lined up in the Great Hall for processing, very literally marked with a piece of chalk so they could be screened for insanity and other mental problems, for physical disability or for disease, or just for abnormal behavior. And eventually they were examined for other diseases such as trachoma of the eye. We're seeing men examined here by public health doctors at Ellis Island. Those same doctors gave people IQ tests to screen out the mentally suspect. And you should notice that each of the officials in these photos are uniformed members of the Public Health Service. In fact, by 1913, the service had 135 commissioned officers, and the majority of them worked at Ellis Island. And they left a record that there was really no question about what their motives were in participating in this process, as this article shows, how Public Health Service prevents contamination of our racial stock by turning back feeble-minded immigrants, and how the series of tests determined exact mentality. There are many, many more examples of how people like Dr. Howard Knox wrote publicly about the eugenic value of his work. Even before then, even before the law passed, Charles Davenport, the acknowledged dean of American eugenics and the director of Long Island's Eugenics Record Office, wrote his colleague, Madison Grant, who had written a famous book called The Passing of the Great Race, and he posed another solution beyond immigration restriction. Can't we just build a wall high enough around this country to keep out those cheaper races, Davenport said? Well, he got his wish when the law was passed in 1924 to limit the immigration of aliens into the United States. And it focused primarily on Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians from Southern Europe. It set up quotas based on the number of people, not that had entered the country in 1924, but groups entering the country, primarily Northern European and white, who had come in before 1890. And so this law too stayed in place along with the quota system for the better part of 40 years. Eugenics Record Office Superintendent Harry Laughlin testified both before and after the law was passed, pushing the idea that old Americans were being swamped by new immigrants and that their higher birth rates would push out old Americans. He advocated for even more serious limitations on migrants. Again, the motive was to limit reproduction of those considered biologically inferior by excluding them from living in the United States. Support for immigration restriction, marriage restriction, racially based restrictions and quotas, and then eventually sterilization, were all meant to address the demise of the majority Anglo-Saxons, whose decrease would mark, as the literature said, the passing of the great race. So this widespread anxiety over what was popularly known as race suicide was on display, especially during the period between the two world wars. There was also, of course, open and pointed hostility to groups like Mexicans, specifically thought of as unfit. And there were arguments to extend the reach of the Quota Act to cover South and Central America more thoroughly. The American law became a model for others. And as he languished in prison, Adolf Hitler praised the law with this language, saying, "It is not our model German republic, but the USA, where efforts are made to conform to the counsels of common sense by refusing immigrants to enter if they're in a bad state of health, by excluding certain races from the right to become naturalized. They have begun to introduce principles similar to those on which we wish to ground the people's state, the Volksstaat." For the sake of completeness, I want to mention prohibition, a law that I'm writing about, one that is not often linked to eugenics, but in fact was very much based in ideas written by people like Caleb Savelby, the early supporter of Galton. When the Women's Christian Temperance Union took up the banner of prohibition, they made it part of school education all over the country. This particular meeting reports on a speaker who proposed that soon the teachings of eugenics will be a vital part of every religion. And these ads appeared touting the course of Miss Mary Tietz of the WCTU, who ran a correspondence school, which she called the School of Gospel and Scientific Eugenics. This catalog of the temperance posters shows another law that is directly related to these eugenic concerns. This, as I said, fueled support for the Prohibition Amendment and was credited with some of the successes of prohibition by no less than former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, who said drunken parents create children like themselves with undesirable traits of character, and every child has a right to be well born. Now, those are most of the laws passed. The laws we've heard the most about recently in popular as well as academic literature are the sterilization laws. And sterilization in America was really the most radical eugenic reform, coercive surgery that would prevent someone from having children. It was at almost the turn of the century, 1907, that Indiana passed the first law, conceived of and supported by public health reformers shown here, John Hurdy, 7-time Secretary of the Indiana State Board of Health, and a 1911 President of the American Public Health Association, who, along with his colleague, Dr. Harry Sharp, who happened to be the doctor at the state prison, lobbied for a sterilization law, which was passed in 1907. Sharp's concern was the horrible habit of masturbation that he observed in prison inmates. He said if he could sterilize them, they would behave. And so the law was then passed to prevent the procreation of confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. And it included in its preamble the assertion that heredity plays the most important part in the transmission of crime, idiocy, and imbecility. And that phrase would reoccur in other state laws years later. The sterilization laws culminated in a Supreme Court case, the case of Buck versus Bell. As this official report shows, it was finally decided in May of 1927. And it was a formal challenge to the Virginia law, which was passed also in 1924, that was described in its preamble as an act to prevent the procreation of feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, inebriate, criminalistic, and other degenerate persons with inferior hereditary potentialities. The law had been crafted based on a model law written in 1914 by this man, Harry Laughlin. Laughlin, of course, worked at the Eugenics Record Office, and he had written in his model law that a social inadequate person is one who fails in comparison with normal people to maintain themselves as a useful member of the organized life of the state. He listed the socially inadequate classes who should be sterilized, saying it was the feeble-minded, the insane, the criminalistic, the epileptic, the inebriate, the diseased, the blind, the deaf, the deformed, and the dependent, including orphans, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, the homeless, and paupers. Laughlin's proposal would have covered millions. The case that his model law got tested in, as it was adopted in part by the state of Virginia, was Buck versus Bell. And these are the people that case focused on. On the right, Emma Buck. On the left, her daughter, Carrie, shown here in 1924. The day before, they had a trial, which essentially determined that Carrie would be sterilized. Carrie was 17 at the time. She had just been committed to the Virginia colony for the epileptic and the feeble-minded. She met her mother there, whom she hadn't seen for at least a dozen years. She was accused, Emma Buck, of being a moral degenerate. She was suspected of being a prostitute. She was declared feeble-minded and unable to take care of herself. Carrie was also declared feeble-minded because only 3 months before her arrival, she had a baby, but she wasn't married. So she too was called a moral degenerate. The baby shown here was examined by doctors and other experts, and they said she was not quite normal, not right, which made the Buck family the perfect example of this brand new 1924 eugenic sterilization law. That's what it had been written for. That's what it had been meant to address. Problem families suffering from mental and moral defects and intergenerational poverty and criminality and sexual excess, and probably most importantly, a tendency to consume more than a small share of tax-supported services. That's what the law was about. It was meant to, over time, eliminate those conditions, the crime, the disease, and the poverty, as well as eliminating from future generations the people who carried them, so it was thought, in their germplasm, what we would call their DNA. So Carrie became the first person to test the new law. She was opposed eventually by John Bell, the doctor who eventually ran the Virginia colony where Carrie was an inmate, and therefore the case was known as Buck versus Bell. Now, if you were a student of eugenics and you'd gone to the summer courses at the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, or for that matter, if you'd gone to one of the 300 plus colleges which taught eugenics, or many high school classes as well, you would have recognized these classic texts of problem families, the Jukes and the Kallikaks. The Jukes was written in the 19th century and it focused on a group of people who had an inordinate number of family members living in the prisons of New York State. They cost the state a lot of money. The bottom line on the argument of the author was that the state had paid in several decades more than $1.25 million, and that didn't count the money paid for whiskey, he said. So that was the first parable of heredity. The second one was written in a book called The Kallikaks, and this was included. I took this page from a textbook that was published in the late 1950s and went on to be published in the 1960s. And it shows Martin Kallikak, the Revolutionary War soldier who, after a particularly difficult battle, had a few too many drinks in the tavern, dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl. She bore him a son known as Old Horror, who had 10 children, from which came the lowest types of human beings, according to this textbook. But then Martin sobered up, went on the straight and narrow, and back home married a woman who is referred to as a worthy Quakeress, who bore him 7 upright and worthy children, and from them came hundreds of the highest type of human beings. This was thought to be kind of a test of an experiment, a controlled experiment in which exposure to this one woman led to deprivation, but exposure to the good woman led to healthy children. Now, the lawyers in Virginia in the Buck case developed their arguments to prove that Carrie Buck's family was just like the Jukes and the Kallikaks. And this pedigree, after the fact, represented the evidence. It shows a family that would swamp the state with the degenerate children who would fill the jails and asylums and the welfare rolls. The whole point of the law was to interrupt that parade of defect. And you can see here how it shows up in the first line, the first generation, Addie Emmett or Emma Buck, whose picture you saw, Frank Buck, her somewhat disappeared but nevertheless real husband, and a series of men marked by question marks who were purportedly the parents of her children, Doris Buck, Roy Smith, and Carrie, marked here with the telltale finger. Clarence Garland was a young man who went to school with Carrie, and he became the father of her daughter, shown here in the third generation, Vivian Alice Elaine Buck, tested at 7 months, according to this, and showing backwardness. The feeble-minded F is marked on all the appropriate people, and the dotted line shows us that they were all illegitimate, thought to be a characteristic that you also inherited. Now, when this reached the Supreme Court 3 years after the trial, the court included a number of real legal giants. There were justices like the famous Louis Brandeis, and of course the Chief Justice, William Howard Taft, who's famous for a number of reasons. He was the largest president ever, and his service was the first and only of a person who was both president and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But Taft also, no matter how accomplished he was, took a back seat to Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. After 25 years on the court, Holmes was the oldest justice, clearly the most famous, shown here on Time magazine's cover on his 85th birthday. He was all but a god to his admirers, and he was thought to have earned this repute by his writing, which was described as a family trait. His father was also a writer and a famous scientist and physician. He had been the editor of the North American Review, as well as a poet, and legend had it that Dr. Holmes promised an extra portion of marmalade to his son each morning if he would only say something clever, and when the boy became a judge, he made his reputation penning phrases that would have earned the marmalade. So we know him as the person who said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and that even unpopular speech should be protected unless it posed a clear and present danger of violence. So Holmes, in this case, adds another line to his judicial resume. Taft gives Holmes the task of writing the court's opinion. He reviews the case records from Virginia, and he writes a decision over the weekend. The Supreme Court had never dealt with the merits of government-mandated surgery, much less a law prescribing operations for state benefit. But the evidence from the Buck trial was clear, said Holmes. A defective grandmother, mother, and child certainly proved the logic of the eugenics law, which was meant to put an end to one family's parade of defects. The law did not offend the Constitution because citizens were often required to make sacrifices for the state. Now, that comment was not an idle comment. Holmes had been in the Army in the Civil War as a young man. He was enlisted. He was sent to the front. He took his first wound, a musket ball in the chest at Ball's Ridge. He returned to his unit for a second battle in Antietam, was shot again. His father found him, nursed him back to life, sent him back to the war, and he only then took a third shot while fighting at Chancellorsville. So his comment, if he could take this kind of punishment, it suggested that if he could face death for the country with his comrades, this sterilization business was nothing but a lesser sacrifice that the country could demand to forestall defect. And so he put all of his sentiments into a written opinion. He said, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices in order to prevent our being swamped by incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." And then making a leap of logic using a single case that he had participated in earlier, a case about vaccination called Jacobson. He said, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes." And so this became the soundbite, the bumper sticker of the eugenics movement in his concluding line, in which he described the Buck family, 3 generations of defect, saying 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. 7 other justices agreed with him. Only Pierce Butler dissented but left no written comment. So that was 1927. And here is the Buck family, mother, daughter, and granddaughter. The rest of the story quickly shows us even more tragedy. This is Dr. Albert Priddy. He's the person who actually committed Carrie Buck. He had already started operating in 1916 on people, even though there was no law. He was sued for malpractice, and that temporarily put an end to his freelance surgeries. And so he went back eventually to get a law written that would provide him legal immunity, little tort reform. He was really the motive force behind the Virginia law. Carrie Buck went on to live another 63 years, and when she died, her family that survived still carried the shame of Holmes' opinion. Here she is in 1983, only weeks before she died. She confirmed to me that she was pregnant in 1923 because she had been raped, not because of any moral failings. And when I later found the grade report card of her daughter, Vivian, it showed that she was on the honor roll in the 2nd grade, only months before she would die at age 8 of an infection following the measles. But these details were hidden after Buck's death, as was the story of Irving Whitehead, Carrie's well-paid lawyer, who betrayed his client and defrauded the court. He essentially threw this case and then went and reported to his opponents that the case was in great shape and they could not hope to be in a better position. The Buck case is long and complex, and as I argue in my book, all of these details, the fraud of the case, were hidden until after Carrie Buck's death. But that didn't matter because the states followed in line. Sterilization laws were passed in total in 32 different jurisdictions. Some 60 to 65,000 people were officially sterilized, and 16 other countries passed sterilization laws. The Nazi law, which used propaganda very similar to what was used in America, showing the expense of keeping people in institutions. One of these says, "You are sharing the load." A hereditarily ill person costs 50,000 Reichmarks per year until they turn 60. Or this one, which showed the cost of caring for, quote, defectives in comparison with the other costs of government. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was one of the very first enactments of Hitler's government, and some 400,000 people were sterilized before the end of the Second World War. We didn't learn until sometime later that Harry Laughlin, the man who wrote the model sterilization law, later testified in the Buck case, won an honorary degree from the Nazis in 1936. And we learned at Nuremberg in the doctor's trial in 1947 that attorneys there would cite the Buck case and read it into the record in defense of Nazi doctors who had done experimental sterilizations in the death camps. In the 75th anniversary of the Buck case, I put up this marker in Charlottesville, Virginia. Governor Mark Warner became the first governor to apologize for eugenics. And eventually, 6 other states followed with apologies. There are markers in other states as well. North Carolina and Virginia have paid small amounts to the very few people who survived sterilization. There, 25 other states have never apologized, expressed regret, or paid a single dollar to any of their victims. So what does this all add up to? Well, if we look to the common idiom of eugenics as it played out in public conversation, open propaganda, and certainly in the law, we find that it includes both a desire for healthier children, those better babies, and an attitude of contempt for all other people on the margins of society. And so I say, you have to round up the usual suspects, people who are the predictable targets of eugenic contempt and the equally predictable victims of eugenic laws and policies. The disabled, criminals, immigrants, people of color, the sexually unconventional, and then finally just the poor. So the sterilization laws covered all those groups: the sexually deviant criminal, the feeble-minded who are responsible, this thing says, for every manner of social ill. And then, of course, the very expensive institutionalized mentally ill. These are headlines from New York, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Arizona. And we should recall that the taking care of disabled people was expensive, and the economic motive was never far from the purpose. From the surface, better breeding through tax cuts was a common eugenic mantra. So, when people ask me about eugenics, and they ask me, what do we need to worry about? I realize it's tempting to focus on new technologies that could lead to practices like cloning, or the potential to manipulate the human genome in new and startling and to date untested ways with technologies like CRISPR, or the sensational and sometimes irresponsible speculations that fill the popular press about the potentially genetic basis for crime, or even the potential for super babies and the hypothetical creation of what might be someone's idea of a master race. But as much as I think it's important to debate the ethical impact of all those new technologies, it concerns me that we spend so much time arguing whether we should call them eugenics. My concern about eugenics in the future is not that we have new technologies that make it possible, but that we have some very old attitudes and some very old-fashioned bigotry that is still focused on the least powerful people in our world, and it attempts to blame them for all our problems. If we focus on those attitudes, we would realize that they were the most important foundation for the practices we now condemn as the worst result of eugenic thinking. I would stop for a minute and say that I think our common understanding of eugenics is often misstated. We connect it readily to the horrors of the Holocaust, and that connection is real. But we don't understand what it meant to all the rest of the people who used the word 100 years ago. If all we understand is that eugenics is what the Nazis did, we are at risk of learning nothing from our history. My second point here is that our current reaction to eugenics is very new. I would argue that it only dates from the mid-1970s. And the public reaction to eugenic history is even more recent, from the 1990s. For the entire 20th century, we lived in a legal regime that incorporated a eugenic value structure that justified state and federal legislation. So if you ask me what the contemporary relevance of eugenics is, this is my answer. We have seen too often lately public displays of unabashed contempt for the disabled, a chorus of hate focused on people who violate conventional sexual norms. We hear daily about the need to eradicate social welfare programs to address crime or poverty or disease, and the attention of the nation has been focused on an unvarnished campaign to ramp up the rhetoric of decay and fear and hate to justify closing the borders against people whose presence would threaten the white demographic balance. And we also hear the old mantra, all of this has to be done to make us safe in the future generations and lower our taxes today. Because all of these strains of thought remain part of our current political landscape, I think eugenics continues to be worth our while as a subject of discussion and historical study. Now, I put this last slide up here because it's got a picture of my book, and they told me I could do that. But the more important part is the digital supplement, which is at buckbbell.com. When I finished this book, I included all of the legal documents and all the documents that are in the public domain, things written before 1924, on that page so that teachers and students and members of the public who are interested could go there, download the documents, read them, study them, at least be aware that they exist. So I will stop there and I think take some questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Normally, if we were in the real world, we'd have a huge round of applause for you. So I will provide that quiet applause. I'm sure everybody else would be thinking the same way. You know, you and I met, so to speak, back in the 90s when I wrote you when I was at the National Center for Science Education about your work. I was interested in eugenics as a former college professor and biological anthropologist. And we were talking about we had some correspondence about eugenics, but also about various kinds of white supremacy kinds of organizations and the rest. And I don't know if at the time I told you a story from my personal experience, but before I went to NCSE, I taught at the University of Kentucky, and I had a research project in a very beautiful area of Appalachia called the Red River Gorge. And I met some quite wonderful Kentuckians there, people who had lived in that area for generations. And there were two sisters that I and my research partners became very friendly with. Both of these sisters had been married twice. Neither of them had children with either of the husbands. Both of the husbands had had other wives, had been married before marrying the women, and both of them had had children by other women. So clearly the reason why these women did not have children had nothing to do with the inability of their spouses to sire children. So, the women thought, well, I guess I just need some children. We were talking once, I was talking with one of the younger of the two sisters. And she said, oh yeah, the public health people used to come by. And one year they came by, and this would have probably been, given the age of these women in the 70s, this would have been probably in the 1930s. And she told me that the public health people had come by, and they wanted all the women in the area to get appendectomies, because after all, when you're living out in the sticks, if you have appendicitis, very likely you're going to die because you can't get to the hospital in time, etc. So this was pitched as a prophylactic medical public health service, that this was going to benefit these women to have these appendectomies. The appendix is not terribly far from the reproductive organs. And I always wondered after I heard that story whether maybe while they were in there they tied a couple of tubes. Have you ever heard of anything like that, sort of where under some other auspice they ended up sterilizing? Because these women, these were normal intelligence women, but because they were Appalachians and they talked funny and they didn't have much education, I'm sure in some communities they would be considered inferior, and we certainly wouldn't want these hillbillies to have any more children. Is that a story that you've ever heard anything similar?
Definitely, Jean. And in fact, people often ask, you say there are 60,000 people who were sterilized, and how do you know that? And the answer is, well, we've got records. We've got state records that some wonderful work was done back in the 1960s by a man who's now deceased, named Julius Paul, political scientist, and he surveyed every state that had a law, and he got letters at a time when this was not a sensitive topic, and he got very frank letters from attorneys general and hospital superintendents telling him how many people they sterilized, and they sent him copies of the records. And so we know at least that many were sterilized under these laws. What we don't know is all the people were sterilized off the books. And there were infinitely more people sterilized off the books than on. So thousands and thousands of people. There's been some wonderful work done in the last 20 years by people younger than I am who have made films and written books about Latinas sterilized in Southern California, people sterilized by the Indian Health Service, thousands and thousands of women in Puerto Rico who were sterilized. And there are accounts of people in various parts of Appalachia, the Blue Ridge Parkway being an important one, where exactly what you described happened. So those people might have gotten to an institution, might have not. North Carolina, who has a lot of attention to North Carolina in recent years because they finally paid reparations to a few people who survived, had a law that allowed any number of people, social workers, teachers, and others, to recommend that somebody be sterilized, and then they would be taken into a hospital, often told that they were having an appendectomy or an examination of some sort, and then came out sterile and often didn't know it. And we think there were hundreds of thousands of those, but the documentation is in individual case files, and no one can compile it to give us a real number.
Yeah, the thing that has always haunted me when I reflect on the two sisters, I won't mention their names obviously, is how much both of them wanted children. and how tragic it was for both of these women that they never were able to have any. So, these two lives were far less rich than they would have been had it not been for that attitude that you very well described in your very interesting and very depressing talk. Okay, Jay, do we have any questions? Here's one from Julie. Do you see a connection between eugenics and the white nationalist movement that seems so riled up by Trump these days?
I do. I think that it becomes difficult when you start using the word eugenics as a synonym for other things that we might find distasteful or even horrific. And so I try to not use it too often because as a historian, I want to make sure I've got the context right. But the attitudes that I was describing are exactly the same. And that's my point. We don't have to call it eugenics. Whatever face that hate takes, when it expresses this kind of contempt for people in specific groups or with specific conditions, is the same motive that the people had to pass laws to sterilize people or worse. So yeah, I do see a connection between the current excitement among white nationalists and the revival of the same kind of attitudes that were in place in order to get the Immigration Restriction Act passed, for example, which was specifically focused on Southern Europeans and Jews.
Yeah, in your talk, you talked about the marginal members of our communities being the ones that tend to be singled out, the people who are not considered typical, whether it's for sexual behavior or for skin color. In the case of my Appalachian friends, you could consider even as a subculture. There's plenty of that going on, and there's plenty of opportunity to discriminate against people that way. I wonder, though, if there are any specific efforts to prevent these people from reproducing, which of course was the nature of the eugenics movements.
Well, I would recommend to anybody who's listening that they watch the documentary called Belly of the Beast, which came out recently and is making the rounds. And it catalogs how hundreds of women were subject to various kinds of reproductive interventions, including coerced sterilization or sterilization they weren't even told about in prison in California within the last dozen years. So, and the motive that was used by the doctor who did those when he was interviewed was exactly the same that's recited in the eugenic sterilization laws. Those people shouldn't have any more children. We don't want any more babies like that. So yeah, that motive is alive and well and being used. It's also what was cited by some right here in Georgia, in the southern part of Georgia, where the immigrant detention camp is, where there are now lawsuits going on involving people who were given hysterectomies or tubal ligations there in terrible conditions and certainly without any kind of informed consent.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I have read some newspaper articles by that. Jay, did you have another question? Since we use common law, how do we prevent these outdated precedents from being used by bigots current and in future cases?
There has been a fair amount of legal reform in the last 20 years. Almost every state has repealed its formal sterilization law. Many states have made it much more difficult, and at least legally you can't sterilize people without either open informed consent, or if you're talking about children or others, they're supposed to go to court. But people still abuse the process. And often there are laws that allow for voluntary sterilization of people. And sometimes people get sterilized there in ways that are hardly voluntary. So the laws have been struck down. There has been a lot of reform in that area, but we still know that abuses take place. Using the precedents, the Buck case has never been overturned, but it's also been generally condemned in recent years, finally all the way up to the Supreme Court. But you don't overturn Supreme Court cases because somebody doesn't like them historically. You have to have an actual case where somebody is subject to the same danger. That's not likely to happen, although I've been wrong before.
What? Thanks for the talk, says Christina. Are you familiar with the recent reports of doctors sterilizing asylum seekers in Georgia? How can we empower marginalized people to speak out against their oppressors? You did address that, but do you have any other suggestions along her last phrase there?
Well, there's an awful lot of people these days who are taking up the banner of the reproductive justice movement and focusing on marginalized populations who, women particularly, who have not been allowed really to control their own reproductive freedom. And that's a battle that goes on in legislatures and in the courts. We'll be hearing a lot more about that, and I think that this is a matter of law, and it will have to be fought out in the legislatures and in the courts.
The thought has occasionally occurred to me that back in the 19-teens and the 1920s, there was not as much known about genetics, about how heredity operated and how materials got from one generation to the next and what kinds of materials were actually inherited, the effects of the environment versus the effects of heredity, the nature-nurture issue. Much less was known back then than even 30 years later. And certainly by the late 20th century and certainly by the 21st century, we know so much more about heredity that the suggestions of these of the past and present day eugenicists just simply have no scientific foundation whatsoever. In fact, if you want to argue against eugenic claims, modern molecularly based genetics is probably your best weapon, because the science just simply is not there to support this. This clearly is, as I was alluding to in my introduction, this clearly is an ideological issue which tried to claim science at one time, but which can certainly no longer do so, and not for decades. But
I think one of the things we learned was, and I mentioned Thomas Hunt Morgan, of course, it was in the 19-teens when he turned against the eugenics movement privately and said, the simplistic thinking that you're using here just doesn't make sense. I study fruit flies, he said. I can't figure out how their eyes work, and you're telling me you know how human beings work. So many scientists who had a hope in this as a branch that they could pursue turned their backs on it. And really, by the time of the Buck case, that was it was pretty clear that the scientific community was against eugenics, but by then it was already baked into the law and stayed there for the better part of the 20th century.
Yes, it's those of us who do like science and looking at things, applying scientific thinking and reasoning to issues, can be very disappointed that a lot of the times they don't listen to us. But that's not new either. We have a question from Katrina. Could you talk about the relationship of eugenics to triage protocols that are now proposed to deal with COVID-19 that severely impact people with disabilities? Interesting question.
Yes, it is an interesting question. One of my colleagues, Leslie Wolf, and another colleague, Wendy Hensel, wrote papers about this, not about eugenics and not about COVID, but in the aftermath of Katrina, because people were putting protocols in place then for who would be evacuated in the case of a hurricane or a natural disaster, and those protocols violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I think some of the things I've seen recently would also be a violation of federal law, because you cannot put a structure in place which will materially disadvantage people just because of the disabilities they have. That's not to say the law is going to stop it. Laws are written on paper, and as we learned recently, that doesn't stop too many people when they're excited. And this is a time, I think, in which a lot of reason has gone out the window, and the law is something that you end up looking at after the fact often. So you're right to say that there is a concern. You should be a concern here. People should be speaking out about this.
I know I was listening to a podcast not too long ago that was discussing exactly that issue, that a woman who did have disabilities, but who basically had a pretty good quality of life, was nonetheless her family was being leaned on by the physicians who really didn't want to expend resources on her. We have a question again, please, from Julie. Do you see potential for a new dangerous wave of eugenics from genetic testing?
Well, there have been concerns that the fear that people have about genetic testing would be a reason for people not to participate in research. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed to protect the people with disabilities, but it wasn't until significantly later that the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act was passed as a federal law to prohibit the use of genetic information or forcing people to take genetic tests in the employment setting, or for that matter, in the writing of medical insurance contracts. It looks like some states are expanding that to cover other kinds of insurance. I've testified in a couple cases in which genetic testing was done, which successfully held the defendants to account for that under those laws. So that's that is a concern that people have had for a long time, and it's not an unreasonable one, but at least we've done something to address that. To me, I wrote an article about this, 20 years ago. And my conclusion was that our concern about so-called genetic secrets is amplified unnecessarily by the fact that we don't have a healthcare system. If everybody had healthcare and you told me that I had a gallbladder problem, I'd say, who cares? If it's genetic, such things are not, I don't think, but I don't know. The point is, if I had insurance that would take care of it, I wouldn't be worried. So our concern about genetic testing is often linked to the fear we have that people will use that information against us and we won't be able to get medical care. Now, there are other concerns too. This is too simple of me, but a big piece of it is healthcare, and that's something we have to address. That I think that will make a lot of the fear about genetic testing go away.
Good point. Insurance companies have a lot of clout. Jay, I think there's another question. Norm Goldblack says, can you speak of our Silicon Valley most famous eugenicist, William Shockley?
Well, I probably don't have enough time, but if you wanted to, I didn't put up a slide. I had a slide with about 50 names on it with, a half dozen Nobel Prize winners and 5 or 6 presidents and lots of other people. The Shockley, Jensen, Murray, and Herrnstein, for that matter, arguments about race and genetics are really out of the direct playbook of the eugenicists. I wrote a ridiculously long piece years ago pointing out that in the book The Bell Curve, there was praise for Harry Laughlin as if he were simply a gentleman scientist. Didn't say anything about his Nazi degree, didn't say anything about his role in writing the sterilization law, didn't say anything about Buck versus Bell. And I thought that was kind of strange. And so there's a lot to be said about Shockley. There's a lot to be said about latter-day eugenists. There's actually a lot of books out there, and I put some of them on my bibliography so you can look at them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, for spending over an hour with us, especially since you're from the East Coast and it's getting kind of late your side of the country. We really appreciate you spending some time with us. And maybe someday in the future we'll get you back again. Thank you, Paul, and good night for Bay Area Skeptics.
Thank you.